The night had settled over Willow Creek like a heavy quilt, muffling the world in silence except for the restless chirping of crickets. My name is Daniel Mercer, and all I wanted after a brutal 12-hour shift was a cold beer and a quiet porch. My wife, Sergeant Emily Mercer, was still at work, somewhere on the other side of town, patrolling the streets like the unshakable officer she was. I'd barely cracked open the can when the knock came. Not a neighborly knock, not the kind that announces someone dropping off sugar or inviting you to a barbecue. This was a hard, deliberate pounding that rattled the wood and cut through the night. I froze for a second, the beer halfway to my lips, the crickets outside suddenly silent, as if even they were waiting for me to answer. "Open up!" "Police," a voice barked from the other side. My stomach twisted. Police? At my door? I set the can down, the condensation leaving a ring on the wooden table, and stepped to the door. Through the peephole, 2 officers stood stiffly, flashlights cutting across the dark yard. Their cruisers idled on the curb, red and blue lights washing against my house like restless waves. I opened the door slowly. "Evening, officers. Can I help you?" The taller of the two, Officer Bradley Henson, a man with a square jaw and eyes that never softened, held a clipboard. The other, Officer Miguel Torres, looked younger, his nerves visible in the way he shifted his weight. "Mr. Mercer?" Henson asked flatly. "Yes. You've been reported for multiple violations of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association bylaws. The HOA has filed an official complaint, and we've been instructed to escort you for questioning regarding." "Excuse me?" I cut in, my pulse spiking. "You're telling me the HOA sent you here? With lights flashing like I'm some kind of fugitive?" Henson's jaw tightened. "We're here because the HOA president, Catherine Holloway, claimed you've been hostile, ignored citations, and her words, not mine, posed a threat to neighborhood safety." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Almost. But my chest burned with anger. Catherine Holloway, the self-proclaimed queen of this neighborhood, had been gunning for me since day one. She didn't like that I refused to plant the approved brand of grass, didn't like that my truck was parked in my driveway instead of hidden away like some shameful secret, and she definitely didn't like that I told her loudly and publicly to stay off my property last week. Now she'd escalated it. Now she'd brought cops to my doorstep. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. Torres looked uneasy, but Henson pressed on. "We need you to come with us voluntarily, sir. If not, we'll have to escalate this matter." I stood there in the doorway, the cool light brushing against my skin, my house glowing softly behind me, the weight of this madness pressing on my chest. I thought of Emily, my wife, the strongest person I knew, still out there somewhere. I almost wished she were here to see this circus. Then, as if conjured by my thought, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoed from the driveway. Headlights swept across the front lawn. A familiar silhouette emerged from the car. Emily. Still in her patrol uniform, her badge glinting under the streetlight, her sidearm holstered at her hip. She carried the authority of the law with every step, her boots hitting the pavement like drumbeats. The officers stiffened instantly. Emily's eyes swept over the scene, the flashing lights, the 2 cops at my door, and me standing there caught in the middle. Her face hardened, the same face that had stared down armed suspects without flinching. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Henson straightened, but for the first time that night, hesitation flickered in his eyes. "Sergeant Mercer," he said, recognizing her immediately. "You were just what?" Emily cut him off, stepping closer, her presence filling the space with unshakable command. "Harassing my husband because some HOA busybody thinks she runs the law? You've got to be kidding me." Torres looked at the ground. Henson's throat bobbed. The crickets outside resumed their song, as if mocking the sudden silence between us all. And in that frozen moment, I realized something: whatever game Catherine Holloway thought she was playing, she had no idea who she'd just messed with. Because Emily wasn't just my wife. She was the law. And she was about to turn this HOA nightmare into a battle Catherine Holloway would never forget. The air outside my front porch felt like it had thickened, every molecule charged with the tension between my wife and the 2 officers. Emily stood tall, her shoulders squared, every ounce of her training radiating off her like a warning flare. "Officer Henson," she said evenly, though her eyes were sharp enough to cut steel. "You want to explain why my husband is being treated like a criminal over a homeowners association complaint?" Henson's lips parted, but the words stalled in his throat. Torres shifted again, uncomfortable, clearly wishing he'd drawn a different assignment tonight. "Sergeant Mercer," Henson finally managed, "we received multiple calls from HOA President Catherine Holloway. She claimed your husband threatened her and refused to comply with repeated citations. She insisted it was a matter requiring immediate police involvement." Emily let out a laugh that was anything but amused. "So let me get this straight. A neighborhood busybody dials 911 and suddenly you two think you're the enforcement arm of the HOA? Since when do we," she tapped the badge on her chest, "work for Catherine Holloway?" The officers stayed silent. I stepped closer to Emily, my voice lower, calmer, though the anger beneath it boiled. "She's been looking for a way to push us out since we moved in. This is just her latest trick." Emily glanced at me, her jaw tightening, then turned back to the officers. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get Holloway on the phone. Tonight. I want to hear exactly what she told dispatch. And if she lied, that's filing a false police report, a criminal offense. Understood?" Henson gave a stiff nod, fumbling for his radio. Torres exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for hours. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled up the street, headlights cutting into the uneasy scene. The door opened, and out stepped Catherine Holloway herself. If Emily was a storm contained in a uniform, Catherine was the opposite, all fake composure wrapped in designer fabric. Her blonde bob didn't move in the breeze, her pearl necklace shone against her neck, and her manicured nails clutched a leather folder. She walked with the confidence of someone convinced the world owed her obedience. "Well," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "looks like the matter is being handled." Emily folded her arms. "Handled? You called officers to my home over HOA rules, Catherine. Explain yourself." Catherine's smile flickered, but she quickly recovered. "Your husband has been in violation for weeks. Unapproved modifications to the property, failure to maintain the yard to community standards, and aggressive behavior toward me personally. I've warned him repeatedly. I had no choice but to escalate." "Escalate?" Emily's voice rose, sharp as a whip crack. "You escalated by abusing law enforcement resources for your personal vendetta." Catherine's eyes darted toward the officers, clearly expecting support. Henson cleared his throat, uneasy, but didn't step in. I took a step forward. "You built that ridiculous fence on the property line without a permit, Catherine. And you thought I'd roll over when I had it taken down. That's what this is really about. Isn't it?" For a split second, her mask slipped. The perfect smile faltered, replaced by a flash of cold fury. "This neighborhood has standards, Mr. Mercer. If you can't respect them, maybe you don't belong here." Emily's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "You don't get to decide who belongs where, Holloway. You certainly don't get to weaponize my colleagues to do it for you." The silence stretched. The flashing lights from the cruisers bathed us all in a surreal glow, red, blue, like we were standing on some makeshift stage. Finally, Torres spoke, his voice hesitant but steady. "Mrs. Holloway, you understand calling in false threats wastes department resources, right? Tonight, there were actual emergencies that went unanswered because of this." Catherine's jaw tightened. "I didn't file a false report. I simply expressed my concerns about safety. It's not my fault if the police take it seriously." Emily stepped closer, her eyes locked on Catherine's. "And now you're hearing it from me, your concerns are baseless. If you try this again, I'll make sure it's your name in the incident report. And believe me, the DA won't find it amusing." The night air held its breath. For the first time, Catherine looked unsettled, her hands gripping her folder tighter. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. Henson, clearly eager to end the standoff, muttered into his radio, canceling whatever formal nonsense he'd been instructed to pursue. The cruiser lights flicked off, plunging the street back into the quiet dark of suburbia. Emily turned back toward me, her shoulders softening just slightly now that the storm had passed. "Go inside, Daniel," she said quietly. "I'll finish this." But I didn't move. "I'm not letting you handle her alone." Emily gave me a look, half frustration, half pride. And then, with a long exhale, she nodded. Catherine, sensing she was losing control, straightened her folder and tried to regain her composure. "This isn't over," she said coldly. "The HOA board meets next week. I'll see to it that your violations are addressed properly." Emily smirked. "Good. Because I'll be there too. And I'll bring the full record of your little stunt tonight." Catherine froze, her face pale for the first time since she'd arrived. I realized then that my wife hadn't just protected me tonight. She'd declared war. And in Willow Creek, where image was everything, Catherine Holloway had just been stripped of her crown in front of her kingdom. As the HOA president stalked back to her SUV, silence settled once again on the street. The officers avoided eye contact, embarrassed, retreating to their cruisers. Within minutes, the road was clear, leaving only me and Emily on the porch, the soft glow of our home behind us. Emily finally let out a deep breath, her hand brushing against mine. "They're not going to stop, Daniel. People like her never do." I squeezed her hand. "Then we don't stop either." She looked at me with a mix of exhaustion and fire in her eyes. And in that moment, I knew the coming days weren't just about mowing grass or painting fences. This was about standing our ground, together, against a woman who thought she could bend the world to her will. And if she wanted war? Well, she just picked the wrong soldier's wife to fight. The days that followed were thick with tension, like storm clouds that refused to move. Willow Creek looked the same on the surface: manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, kids on bicycles, but under it all, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Everyone had seen the flashing lights outside my house that night. Everyone had seen Catherine Holloway's SUV parked at the curb. And everyone knew something had shifted. When the HOA board meeting rolled around the following Thursday, the clubhouse was packed. Normally, half a dozen retirees and a few board parents showed up. That night, nearly the whole neighborhood crammed into folding chairs, the air heavy with expectation. I sat near the back, Emily beside me in plain clothes, though her posture was no less commanding. She scanned the room like she was back on duty, cataloging faces, watching movements. At the front table, Catherine Holloway adjusted her pearl necklace, her smile plastered on like armor. Flanking her were the other board members: Thomas Whitaker, a balding man who nodded along to whatever Catherine said, and Janet Riley, who looked perpetually tired of the drama but never spoke up against it. Catherine cleared her throat into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen of Willow Creek, thank you for attending tonight's meeting. As you know, our community thrives on order and respect for the standards that keep our neighborhood safe and beautiful. Unfortunately, we've had incidents." Her gaze swept the crowd, landing squarely on me. "Certain residents refuse to follow guidelines, endangering the harmony of our community. These violations include unauthorized property changes, aggressive conduct, and outright hostility toward this very board." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily leaned closer to me. "She's stacking the deck. Watch." Sure enough, Catherine held up a stack of papers. "Here are documented complaints. Overgrown grass, unapproved construction, and threats directed at me personally. This behavior cannot stand. I am recommending immediate fines and, if necessary, legal action." She set the papers down with a flourish, as if she'd just presented irrefutable evidence in a courtroom. The room buzzed, half the neighbors nodding, the other half whispering skeptically. Emily rose to her feet. The scrape of her chair echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Sergeant Emily Mercer, LAPD," she announced, her voice steady and clear. Every head turned. Even Catherine's mask slipped for a heartbeat. "I'd like to address the board," Emily continued, stepping forward. She didn't wait for permission. She simply walked to the microphone, her presence commanding the space. "Catherine Holloway claims my husband has been aggressive, hostile, and unsafe. What she failed to mention is that last week she called armed officers to my door with fabricated allegations. She lied to dispatch. She attempted to use the police as her personal enforcers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily's voice sharpened. I've reviewed the recordings myself. The language she used implied immediate danger. That's why officers arrived with lights and sirens. Do you know what that means? It means while my colleagues were knocking on our door over lawn height, real emergencies went unanswered. Catherine shot to her feet. That is not true, she snapped, her voice high and thin. I expressed legitimate concerns for community safety. Emily's eyes locked on her like steel. Legitimate concerns don't get officers sent with guns drawn to a man's porch at midnight. You abused the system. And if you attempt it again, I will personally see charges filed for false reporting and harassment. The room was electric now, neighbors murmuring, some openly glaring at Catherine. I stood then, my voice less polished but no less firm. This is about control. Catherine built a fence on my land without a permit. When I tore it down, she retaliated. Every so-called violation she's listed? It's her way of punishing us for not bowing to her. A man from the crowd, George Allen, who'd lived in Willow Creek for 30 years, stood. I've had enough of this, he said loudly. My mailbox color wasn't regulation beige, and Catherine threatened me with fines. Now I hear she's sending cops to people's homes? That's not leadership. That's tyranny. Others chimed in. A mother of two said she'd been fined for leaving toys in her yard overnight. An older couple admitted Catherine had trespassed on their property to inspect their flower beds. The tide was turning fast. Catherine tried to shout over the voices, but her words were drowned out. She slammed her gavel, her face red. Order! Order, I demand order. But no one listened. Finally, Janet Riley, the weary board member, leaned into her microphone. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in President Holloway. The room fell into a stunned silence. Thomas Whitaker sputtered. You can't just. Yes, we can, Janet said firmly. Effective immediately. The crowd erupted in applause, neighbors raising their hands in agreement, some even standing in support. Catherine looked around, desperate, her power crumbling before her eyes. You can't do this. I built this community. I am this community. Emily stepped closer, her voice quiet but sharp enough for Catherine to hear. You were. But not anymore. The final vote was nearly unanimous. Catherine Holloway was removed as HOA president that night, her reign collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. She stormed out of the clubhouse, her SUV peeling away into the night, but no one followed her. No one defended her. When the meeting ended, neighbors approached us, some to thank Emily, others to apologize for staying silent for so long. The air felt lighter, as though the invisible chokehold Catherine had on Willow Creek had finally been broken. Later, as Emily and I walked home under the quiet starlight, I squeezed her hand. You know you didn't just save me tonight, right? You saved all of them. She smiled faintly, exhaustion in her eyes but pride in her voice. Sometimes standing up to a bully means standing up for everyone they've hurt. That's the job on or off duty. I looked at her then, my wife, my shield, my storm, and I realized Catherine had been right about one thing: this neighborhood had standards. But they weren't hers. They were ours now. And no matter what came next, Willow Creek would never be the same.